So, we meet again, Steel Boy.
Hopefully for the last time, morally ambiguous villain.
Villain, you say? I'm the one keeping everything together. Without me, chaos will reign. Despotism will yield nothing but misfortune. It is order that brings stability.
Listen, you know what? I don't really want to sit here and have a mental breakdown as you ramble on about some sort of greater good. We're opposed to one another, so why don't we just fight and go home?
Home, you say? I have no home. I have sworn myself to those I serve.
You're rambling again? I really don't want to hear why you think this is a good idea.
Good, you say? What is good? How many lives have you...
Problem solved. I don't get paid enough for this. Everything is connected. To learn anything, you have to build on what you already know. Whether it's science, art, or philosophy, we can connect everything to anything. So let's learn anything. Let's find those connections and let's build our intuition. Welcome to Intuition. I'm your host, Evan Noche, a blessing in disguise. Such a strange phrase. It implies we received a gift that's dressed as a curse, that something bad that's happened to us was also a good thing. In other words, a blessing in disguise is something bad and good at the same time. How is that possible? Something to be simultaneously good and bad for you. That's what today's episode is about. A paradoxical relationship between good and bad, vice and virtue, and right and wrong, and trying to distinguish one from the other. Unfortunately, the subject of this episode may tread on the toes of your beliefs, religious or otherwise, which is something I try not to encroach upon. But if you would be kind enough to keep an open mind, I believe there's some interesting things we can learn about ourselves. Now, the first way we could possibly untangle this mess of morality is to ask God, or the gods. You see, philosophers have been debating this whole morality issue since before Jesus was even born. In roughly the 4th century BCE, Plato wrote a series of conversations between Socrates and other people. We don't think these conversations ever really happened, but since Socrates didn't write anything down, it's the best lead we have into the Socratic method as it's known. In a dialogue named Euthyphro, Socrates discusses what it means to be pious or follow an ethical code of one's religion with Euthyphro, who is accusing his father of killing a servant unjustly. I will now be acting out some excerpts from Euthyphro, condensed for brevity, with a special guest. And what is your suit, Euthyphro? Are you the pursuer or the defendant?
I am the pursuer.
Of whom?
My father.
Your father? And what is he accused?
Of murder, Socrates.
By the powers, Euthyphro, how little does the common herd know of the nature of right and truth? I suppose that the man whom your father murdered was one of your relatives, for if he had been a stranger, you would have never thought of prosecuting him.
I'm amused, Socrates, at your making a distinction between one who is a relation and one who is not a relation, for surely the pollution is the same in either case, if you knowingly associate with the murderer when you ought to clear yourself of him by proceeding against him. The real question is whether the murdered man has been justly slain. If justly, then your duty is to let matter alone. If unjustly, then even if the murderer lives under the same roof with you and eats at the same table, proceed against him.
Good heavens, Euthyphro! If your knowledge of religion and of things pious and impious are so very exact, I think that I cannot do better than to be your disciple. And therefore, I adjure you to tell me the nature of piety and impiety, and of murder, and of other offenses against the gods. What are they?
Yes, I should say that what all the gods love is pious and holy, and the opposite which they all hate impious.
Ought we to inquire the truth of this, Euthyphro?
We should inquire.
The point which I should first wish to understand is whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved by the gods.
I do not understand your meaning, Socrates.
I will endeavor to explain. We speak of carrying, and we speak of being carried, of leading and being led, seeing and being seen. You know that in all such cases there is a difference, and you know in what the difference lies?
I think that I understand.
And thus, is it not that which is loved distinct from that which loves?
Certainly.
Well, and now tell me, is that which is carried in this state of carrying because it is carried, or for some other reason?
No, that is the reason. An object is carried simply because it is being carried.
And the same is true of what is led and of what is seen.
True.
And what do you say of piety, Euthyphro? Is not piety, by your definition, loved by all the gods?
Yes.
Because it is pious or holy, or for some other reason?
No, that is the reason. Piety is loved because it is holy. It is not holy because it is loved.
Then that which is dear to the gods is not holy as you affirm.
How do you mean, Socrates?
I mean to say that either what God loves is holy, or what is holy is loved by God. An object cannot be carried by itself.
I see. Therein lies a contradiction.
Then we must begin again and ask, what is piety?
Another time, Socrates, for I am in a hurry and must go now.
Alas, my companion, will you leave me in despair? Alright, so that was only a fraction of Euthyphro, but we already have some interesting arguments about the nature of God and morality. Euthyphro attempts to answer Socrates' question of what is piety. For clarification, piety is being in good moral and ethical conscience. Euthyphro proclaims that piety is doing what is loved by the gods. In modern theology and philosophy, we have abstracted this into the DCT, or Divine Command Theory. Morality is whatever God commands. And to many philosophers, this presents a dilemma, the one Socrates describes in his carry or be carried argument. Either God commands things which are already morally right, or whatever God commands is morally right because God commands it. This is often compared to a devil with two horns, as to grab either horn is not preferable. Allow me to explain. If God commands what is already morally right, then morality is a concept that exists above God. In other words, God has to follow the rules of morality. This is the problem if we view God as omnipotent or all-powerful, as there is something more powerful than God, morality. The other horn states that what God commands is moral because God commands it. This argument would mean that not following God's commands to a T would be immoral. There is no room for interpretation as morality becomes arbitrary. merely a set of commands that everyone needs to follow. Both of these situations are not ideal, which either means our assumptions about God are wrong, or assumptions about morality are wrong. In other words, we did not find a decisive answer to our question of what is right and wrong. Let's go ahead and take a break, and when we return, we will continue to browse for a philosophical answer to the phrase, a blessing in disguise, and what it means to be moral.
Hey Tom, the bar cart was out of the usual, so I got a soda instead.
I guess that'll have to do.
Anything interesting happen up here?
Nope. Just empty track both ways. What is it?
5 people are on the track up ahead, and the alternate track has 1 person on it too.
Oh, switch the tracks. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Switch the tracks now and we maximize the utility of the situation.
You are way too eager to do this. Have you been practicing for this?
Now is not the time. Switch the tracks.
Fine! They jumped out of the way.
What? That's not supposed to happen. Huh. I guess philosophy doesn't have all the answers. Welcome back. Before the break, we discussed Plato's Euthyphro and looked to God to answer our question of what is right and wrong. And since we weren't able to get a rock-solid answer, let's turn to a different line of questioning. Since you've been primed for this more philosophical thinking on the nature of good and bad, take a second to think about these. First, are morally good actions a matter of objectivity or subjectivity? And second, does the way you perform an action have any bearing on the morality of that action, or is just the result important? I'll give you a chance to think about these while I clarify the questions. Objectivity in this context means that there exists a best action for each scenario, while subjectivity would be that moral actions are perspective dependent. So, if you agree with the statement that every situation has a correct moral action, you would probably favor objectivity. But if you believe the best moral action is not definable by you, you would probably favor subjectivity. For the second question, it's a matter of what part of an action do you weigh morally. If you agree with the statement, being moral is about achieving the best outcome, you would probably prefer the ends over the means. But if you believe that being moral stems from your conduct and behavior, you would probably favor the means over the ends. Now, based on your answers to these questions, or how much you agree with each side, there are one of 4 very broad categories of ethics you could fall under. Mind you, these are drastic simplifications, and any resident philosophers will probably be kicking and screaming by now. So, to refresh, we have 2 sets of categories: objective versus subjective, and action versus conduct. The more dominant of these categories is objective versus subjective, which will now be called universalism versus moral relativism. Universalism's primary tenet is that there is a set of values which applies universally to all individuals. You will find most, if not all, religions fall under this umbrella. However, you do not need to be religious to be a universalist. International human rights fall under this category too. Moral relativity is the opposite of universalism. Moral relativity states that no one set of rules or code exists that everyone can follow to be moral. Instead, morals are constructs formed either within our minds or by the environment we find ourselves in. Of course, this also means a moral relativist can claim no morals exist and that all actions are permissible. It's too late now, Alice. Down the rabbit hole we go. I mentioned earlier I was going to split everyone into 4 camps. So now under these 2 larger categories of universalism and moral relativism, we can split these philosophies again based on the second question: do the ends justify the means? Under universalism, if you believe that the ends can justify the means, you may agree with utilitarianism. The goal of utilitarianism is to maximize utility, meaning to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain for the greatest number of people. Jeremy Bentham, considered the founder of utilitarianism, said, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do." This line of thinking has come to be known as hedonic calculus, based on the Greek philosophy hedonism, which sought to maximize pleasure in all activities. In utilitarianism, it's almost easy to calculate the morality of an action, since all you would need to do is consider which action will generate the greatest pleasure in the greatest people for the longest time. It's also this kind of thinking that gives rise to the trolley problem, as joked about in the break. If a train is headed towards 5 people and you can switch the train to hit 1 person instead, utilitarianism says, "Pull the lever, Kronk," since you would be minimizing the pain of the situation. Still falling under universalism, but with the idea that the method or conduct of your actions is important, comes deontology. Simply put, deontology states that actions themselves are more important in determining morality than the consequences of those actions. Arguably, the most prominent voice in deontology is Immanuel Kant, whose ethics theories are called Kantian ethics. Kant's main issue with utilitarianism was the concept of good values or goodwill. Anything truly good must be intrinsically good and require no special circumstances whatsoever. Kant also believed that we have a duty to moral law, kind of like the voice in the back of our heads. This duty causes us to oblige to these values even when breaking them would get us what we desire most. If you've ever said, "I'd never stoop that low," you have fallen prey to moral law. Kant's recipe for doing good is characterized by what he calls the categorical imperative, which is summarized by the statement,
"Act only according to that maxim, by which you can also will that it would become a universal law,"
which is basically a really fancy way of saying the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Maxim means ethical rule. So he is saying only follow ethical rules that you can rationally see as bettering the world by that rule. So if you want stealing to be ethical, you have to rationally see the world as better off if everyone is stealing from one another. we progress under the other umbrella of moral relativity. We'll start with the method of conduct side, not the action side first. Moral relativity is hard to pin down in this kind of way, but the closest thing to a subjective system that values the actions people take is ethical subjectivism. On a first listen, the two might sound interchangeable, but there is a distinct difference between the two. Ethical subjectivism claims that ethical truths are based on people's mental thoughts or feelings on an action. For an ethical subjectivist, the words right and wrong don't really have any value other than describing one's thoughts on actions. Saying,
"Stealing is wrong,"
is as fruitless as saying,
"I hate stealing."
For a more niche version of ethical subjectivism, we can turn to moral non-cognitivism, which views moral statements like stealing is wrong as neither true nor false. In this limbo, judging something to be moral is a mental exercise that never leaves the confines of the mind. Our final school of thought resides under this moral relativism, but is under the condition that only the results of the actions matter. This is the most difficult one of all to peg down. So, in my opinion, this realm falls into what is known as nihilism. Now, if you've done any reading in philosophy, you've probably come across nihilism. It's the belief that knowledge, morality, and meaning are constructs of human imagination. And in its darkest form, existential nihilism goes one step further, stating that life itself has no intrinsic value. Friedrich Nietzsche, the most famous nihilist philosopher, was highly critical of objectivism about morals and knowledge. Particularly as knowers, let us not be ungrateful towards such resolute reversals of the familiar perspectives and valuations with which the spirit has raged against itself all too long. To see differently in this way for once, to want to see differently, is no small discipline, and preparation of the intellect for its future objectivity, the latter understood not as disinterested contemplation, which is a non-concept and absurdity, but rather as the capacity to have one's pro and contra in one's power, and to shift them in and out, so that one knows how to make precisely the difference in perspectives and effective interpretations useful for knowledge. Which, translated into English, means that objectivity is impossible to discern from one point of view. It is only through looking at things from another point of view and understanding the difference between perspectives that we can obtain anything close to useful knowledge. Reached the end of the rabbit hole. 4 separate arguments on the nature of morality. Have your answers to those questions changed? Have you found a philosophy you agree with, or are you just more confused than before? Regardless, we started this discussion with the common phrase, a blessing in disguise. So, what do each of our 4 philosophies say on the nature of something bad and good at the same time? The universalist would say, anything that maximizes your pleasure was worthwhile, bad or otherwise. The deontologist would say,
as long as you are treated with dignity, the good outweighs the bad.
The moral relativist would say,
maybe it's bad from your point of view.
And the nihilist would say, who cares? You're still breathing, right? If you like what you heard here and want to learn more, the content of this episode comes in part from Euthyphro by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett, as well as other sources which you can find out about in the description. If you would like to view a transcript or want to cite this episode, that information is also in the description. Intuition is an independent project currently run only by myself, so if you want to hear more, please share this with your friends and family. Your support is invaluable. That means valuable, by the way.